There is a moment, and if you have lived long enough, you know this moment when you are standing in the middle of your own life, completely still, and you realize something that no one ever warned you about. You realize that the person you have become is someone you no longer recognize, not because something terrible happened, not because the world broke you, but because somewhere between who you used to be and who you are right now, you quietly, almost invisibly, stopped becoming. And the terrifying part is that you did not notice. The days kept moving, the calendar kept changing, the years kept passing, but you stayed exactly the same. And somehow, without ever making a conscious decision to do so, you began to live the same year over and over again. Most people will never admit this, not even to themselves, because admitting it means confronting something that feels too raw, too uncomfortable, too close. It means accepting that the life you are living is not the one you were meant to live, that the dreams you once held with trembling excitement in your chest have slowly been replaced by routines, by habits, by a quiet, steady, suffocating kind of comfort. And comfort, as you will come to understand deeply through this journey we are about to take together, is the most dangerous thing that can ever happen to a human being who was built for more. Here is what no one tells you about transformation. Here is the secret that every self-help book dances around, that every motivational speech skims over, that every success story conveniently leaves out of the highlight reel. The reason most people never change, the real reason, the one buried so deep it almost never sees daylight, is not because they lack motivation. It is not because they lack information. It is not because the world is unfair, though sometimes it is. It is not because they are lazy, though sometimes they tell themselves that story, so they do not have to look deeper. The reason most people never change is this: they want a new life, but they are not willing to become a new person. Let that land for a moment. Sit with it, because that sentence contains an entire psychology, an entire explanation for every goal abandoned, every resolution broken, every dream that never made it past January. People pray for new outcomes while bowing at the altar of old habits. They beg for different results while clutching their old identity like a security blanket. They want the destination without the journey, the transformation without the discomfort, the harvest without ever being willing to burn the old field. Think about someone you know, or maybe this is you, who has been saying the same things for years. I am going to start eating better. I am going to work on my finances. I am going to leave that relationship that drains me. I am going to start that business. I am going to finally prioritize my health. They say it with complete sincerity. They feel the urgency in their chest when they say it. They mean it every single time. But the words float up into the air and disappear like smoke, and 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later, they are saying the same thing again, with the same sincerity, the same urgency, the same conviction that this time will be different. But it never is. And the reason it never is has nothing to do with willpower. It has nothing to do with discipline. It has everything to do with identity, with the quiet, deeply embedded story they are telling themselves about who they are. Because here is what the science of psychology and the wisdom of every great teacher across every era of human civilization agrees on. People do not act in contradiction to their self-image for long. You can force a behavior change for a week, maybe a month, but if your identity, your deep, down, bone level belief about the kind of person you are, has not changed, You will always find your way back to who you believe yourself to be. You cannot outperform your identity. You cannot out-discipline your self-image. You cannot outrun the story you are living inside of. And so the first thing we must do, before we talk about habits or strategies or mindset shifts, is talk about the thing underneath all of those things. We must talk about you. Not the version of you that gets dressed in the morning and goes through the motions of living, but the version of you that exists in the quiet. The version that whispers at 3 in the morning. The version that flinches when you get close to something real. The version that has been protecting you in all the ways that are slowly, quietly, keeping you small. That version of you has a name. It is called your old identity. And on this journey, we are going to learn how to say goodbye, not with hate, not with shame, not with the kind of toxic self-loathing that masquerades as motivation in so many corners of the self-improvement world. We are going to say goodbye with something far more powerful, with understanding, with gratitude, and with the clear-eyed courage of someone who knows that the most loving thing they can do for their future self is to stop protecting their past one. Because here is the truth that will anchor everything you hear today. Every new chapter of your life requires the death of an old identity. Every version of you that you are about to become requires that a previous version of you be allowed to end. Not destroyed, not erased, not hated into submission, but gently, deliberately, lovingly released. The way you release a chapter in a book that was beautiful, that mattered, that taught you something essential, but that the story has moved beyond. You are not here to stay the same. You never were. And the fact that you are listening to these words right now tells me something important about you. It tells me that somewhere inside, you already know this. Somewhere inside, there is a version of you pressing against the glass of who you currently are, trying to get out. And everything that follows is a map, a guide, a conversation between who you have been and who you are capable of becoming. So let us begin at the very foundation of everything. There is a concept in psychology that researchers and behavioral scientists have spent decades studying, writing about, arguing over in journals and lecture halls and laboratories, and it is this, the self concept. The internal picture a person holds of who they are, and while the academic language around it can become dense and complicated, the core idea is remarkably simple and devastatingly important. Your self-concept, your identity, is not just how you think of yourself. It is the filter through which you process every single experience of your life. It is the lens through which you see every opportunity, every challenge, every relationship, every setback, every success. It shapes what you notice and what you dismiss, what you pursue and what you avoid, what you believe is possible for you and what you have decided, without perhaps ever consciously making the decision, is simply not meant for people like you. Your identity is not a description. It is a prescription. When you say, "I am not a morning person," you are not describing a biological reality. You are issuing a directive to your nervous system about how to behave before the sun rises. When you say, "I am terrible with money," you are not stating a financial fact. You are signing a contract with your subconscious that says, "Do not bother trying too hard here, because this is just who we are." When you say, "I have always been anxious," or "I have never been athletic," or "I am just not the kind of person who is successful in relationships," you are not reporting observations. You are constructing a cage and then decorating it so it feels like a home. This is not a criticism. This is simply how human minds work, and understanding it is the beginning of everything. The psychologist William James, writing more than a century ago, described the self as having two dimensions. There is the I, the subjective, observing self, the one doing the experiencing, the one reading these words right now. And there is the me, the objective self, the content of your experience, the collection of beliefs and memories and roles and narratives that you carry around as your identity. And what James understood, and what decades of research since have confirmed, is that these two dimensions of the self are in constant conversation with each other. I is always observing the me and making decisions based on what it sees. The trouble is that most people never stop to question the content of the me. They inherited it. They absorbed it from childhood environments, from parents who were themselves operating from inherited identities, from teachers who passed on their limitations as easily as their knowledge, from peers who defined belonging by shared smallness, from a culture that often rewards conformity and quietly punishes the audacity of becoming something different. And so the stories they tell about who they are were written largely by other people, in other times, under circumstances that have long since ceased to exist. And yet they keep living by those stories. They keep honoring those old definitions with their daily choices. They keep deferring to an identity that was assigned to them, rather than one they consciously chose. Here is how identity works in practice, and why it is so powerful and so difficult to escape. Your identity generates your beliefs. Your beliefs generate your thoughts. Your thoughts generate your emotions. Your emotions generate your behaviors. Your behaviors generate your results. And your results over time reinforce your identity. It is a loop, a beautiful, elegant, completely self-sealing loop. And the place where most people try to break the loop is at the level of behavior. They try to change what they do without ever changing who they believe they are. And so the loop snaps back. Every single time. This is why diets fail, not because the diet was wrong, but because the person who started the diet still fundamentally identifies as someone who struggles with food, someone who always gains the weight back, someone for whom health has always been a battle. And the identity wins. It always wins. This is why people escape bad relationships only to build identical ones with different people. Not because they are unlucky, but because their identity has not changed. Because somewhere deep inside, they still believe the same things about what love looks like, what they deserve, what relationships inevitably become, and the identity wins, always. This is why people get windfalls of money, inheritances, bonuses, lucky breaks, and within a startlingly short time, return to exactly the financial level they were at before. Not because money is mysterious, but because your identity includes a set point about wealth, about what people like you are allowed to have, about what money means and how it moves. And the identity wins. Every single time, until you change it. Your self-concept also generates what psychologists call narrative identity, the ongoing story you tell yourself about your life, about what things mean, about where you came from, about where you are going, about what is possible. And this narrative is extraordinarily sticky. It is designed, from an evolutionary standpoint, to be consistent. The brain does not like cognitive dissonance. It does not like holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. And so, when new information arrives that contradicts your story about who you are, one of two things happens. Either you update the story, which is growth, and it is uncomfortable, or you reject the new information. You explain it away, minimize it, distort it, or ignore it entirely so that your existing narrative stays intact. This is why people talk themselves out of opportunities, why they dismiss compliments, why they cannot hold on to success when it arrives, why they find ways to self-sabotage, not because they are broken, but because the brain is trying to make reality match the story. The story says, "I am not the kind of person who has this," and so the brain, loyal servant that it is, goes to work making sure reality aligns. The philosopher Epictetus, writing from slavery 2,000 years ago, understood something that modern neuroscience is only now catching up to. He wrote that men are disturbed not by the things which happen to them, but by the opinions about the things. What he was pointing at is precisely this: the story is more powerful than the event. The meaning you assign to your experience is more formative than the experience itself. Two people can live through identical circumstances and construct entirely different identities from them. One person experiences early failure and decides they are someone who learns from setbacks and grows stronger. Another experiences identical failure and decides they are someone failure follows. Both stories are products of choice, even when that choice is made unconsciously, which means they can both be chosen differently. Identity is also relational. We do not form our self-concepts in isolation. We form them in the mirror of other people's reactions. In the stories communities tell about who belongs and who does not, in the roles we are assigned within the systems we inhabit. And this relational dimension of identity is why personal transformation so often feels threatening, not just to the person changing, but to the people around them. When you begin to step outside the identity that a system, a family, a workplace, a social group has assigned to you, the system often pushes back, not because the people in it are malicious, but because the system is organized around predictability and your transformation is unpredictable. Your change is a disruption, and systems resist disruption the way the body resists infection, quickly, powerfully, and without asking your permission first. Understanding all of this, the self-reinforcing loop, the narrative structure, the social embedding of identity, is not meant to overwhelm you. It is meant to reveal the actual terrain of the transformation you are attempting. Because you cannot navigate a landscape you cannot see, and now you can see it clearly. You can see why change is not simply a matter of wanting it enough. You can see why information and motivation alone are almost never sufficient. And you can see, with equal clarity, that change is absolutely possible because every element of the system that keeps you stuck is a system that can, with the right understanding and the right effort, be changed. The human brain was not designed for happiness. It was designed for survival. And the single most important thing that the survival-oriented brain needs in order to feel safe is predictability, pattern, familiarity, the known. Because in the evolutionary environment where our psychology was forged, the unfamiliar was genuinely dangerous. The stranger in the dark, the new sound in the forest, the unfamiliar food, the unknown path. Novelty meant risk, and risk, in a world where threats were physical and immediate, meant death. We do not live in that world anymore, but we carry that brain. And that brain is running an ancient operating system that was not written for the modern landscape of growth, opportunity, reinvention, and deliberate self-creation. And so when you try to change, genuinely change, at the level of identity, your nervous system responds the way it was designed to respond to any unknown territory. It sends up a flare. It activates the alarm. It fills your body with resistance and your mind with reasons why this is a terrible idea, why now is not the right time, why the risk is too great, why it would be better, safer, wiser to wait. And you call this fear. But it is not fear of failure most of the time. Not really. The deeper fear, the one coiled underneath the polite excuses and rational objections, is something far more primal. It is the fear of no longer being yourself. Because when you change at the level of identity, you are not just changing what you do. You are changing who you are, and who you are is the most fundamental thing you have. Your sense of self is your psychological home. Your identity is not just what you believe about yourself, it is the ground beneath your feet. And the prospect of losing that ground, even in service of a better life, can feel like an annihilation. Psychologists have a term for this ego threat. When something challenges the core structure of our self-concept, we experience it not as an opportunity, but as a danger. The brain cannot easily distinguish between a threat to the body and a threat to the identity. Both trigger the same alarm system. Both generate the same cocktail of physiological stress. Both activate the same drive to retreat, to defend, to protect. And so the person who wants to change their career hears the inner voice say, "But what if you fail and have nothing?" The person who wants to leave the relationship hears, "But who will you be without them?" The person who wants to pursue the dream hears, "But what if you pursue it, and it turns out you were never good enough?" These are not logical objections. They are identity defenses. And they are powerful, because they are dressed in the language of reason, while operating entirely in the domain of fear. There is a specific pattern that psychologists call the terror of potential. This is the particular dread that arises not from the possibility of failure, but from the possibility of success. Because success, real success, the kind that requires you to fully inhabit your capability, demands that you become visible. It demands that you operate at a level where the stakes are higher, where the exposure is greater, where the distance you can fall is farther. And for many people, especially those who learned in childhood that visibility was dangerous, that standing out invited criticism or punishment or abandonment, the prospect of success carries its own particular brand of terror, so they stop themselves before they arrive, not consciously. The stopping is so seamless, so expertly timed, that it looks from the outside like bad luck or poor timing or a market that was not ready. But it is none of those things. It is the identity protecting itself from the danger of being fully seen. There is another dimension to this resistance that is equally important and far less discussed. And it is this: the people around you have a relationship not with who you are becoming, but with who you have always been. And consciously or not, many of them have a vested interest in you remaining that person. This is not cynicism. This is social psychology. Human beings are profoundly relational creatures. Our identities exist partly in the web of other people's perceptions. We are, in a very real sense, partly who the people around us see us as. And when you change, when you start showing up differently, when you start making choices that do not fit the role you have always played in the social system you inhabit, it creates friction. You have seen this. Maybe you have lived this. The friend who becomes subtly competitive when you start getting healthy. The family member who makes jokes about your ambition. The partner who finds reasons to doubt every new direction you try. The colleague who wants you to commiserate about how nothing ever changes. who seems almost personally offended by your decision to believe things can be different. These are not bad people, most of them. They are operating from the same fear of change that you are, and your transformation is a mirror they did not ask to look into. There is a phenomenon in systems theory called homeostasis, the tendency of any system to return to its previous state of balance after being disturbed. And it operates not just in biological systems, but in social ones. Every family, every workplace, every community of friends is a system with its own homeostatic set point, its own established equilibrium. And when one member of that system begins to change significantly, the system itself will exert pressure, subtle and sometimes not so subtle, to restore the equilibrium, to pull the changing member back into the shape they used to occupy. Not out of malice, out of the system's instinctive drive toward the familiar balance it has organized itself around. This is why personal transformation often requires not just internal change, but also a willingness to renegotiate your social contracts, to have difficult conversations, to sometimes step back from or entirely away from relationships that are not compatible with who you are becoming. This is one of the most painful dimensions of growth, and it is one that most people are not prepared for. They expect that the people who love them will unconditionally celebrate their transformation. And sometimes they do. But sometimes the people who love the old version of you do not quite know what to do with the new one. And holding steady in the face of that dissonance requires a quality of inner sureness that can only come from being deeply rooted in the identity you are building, rather than the one you are leaving. And then there is something even more subtle, even more seductive, even more difficult to name. Something that writers and philosophers call the comfort of familiar suffering, because it is a strange but undeniable truth of human psychology that we can become deeply, perversely attached to our own pain, not because we enjoy the pain itself, but because the pain is known. The pain is familiar. The pain has a shape we recognize, a weight we have learned to carry, a rhythm we have adapted our whole lives around. And the known suffering, no matter how terrible, carries a strange comfort that the unknown future, no matter how promising, simply cannot yet provide. This is the person who stays in the job they hate, because at least they know what to expect. The person who returns to the relationship that breaks them, because at least they understand it. The person who holds on to the grief, or the anger, or the bitterness, not because it serves them, but because releasing it would mean they no longer know exactly who they are, because their identity has become intertwined with their suffering, and releasing the suffering would require releasing a version of themselves they have lived inside for so long that the thought of existing without it feels not like freedom, but like emptiness. There is a concept in Buddhism called attachment to suffering, the paradoxical phenomenon of clinging to pain, because at least it is something solid to hold, at least it is real, at least it is known. The unknown future, the one where the suffering is gone and something new is possible, offers no such solidity, and so the suffering stays, not because the person wants to suffer, but because the suffering is the most reliable thing they have, and reliability, to a nervous system trained on unpredictability, is everything. Comfortable prisons are still prisons, but they are very hard to leave. Understanding all of these layers of resistance is not meant to make change feel impossible. The opposite is true, because once you can see the resistance for what it is, not a sign that you should not change, not evidence that you cannot, but simply the entirely predictable response of a nervous system doing its job. You can stop arguing with it and start working with it. You can acknowledge the fear without obeying it. You can feel the pull of the familiar without following it. You can recognize the social pressure without surrendering to it. And in that gap between feeling the resistance and being controlled by it, the entire possibility of transformation lies. There is a woman I want to tell you about. Let us call her Adaze. And I want you to picture her not as a character in a story, but as a composite of every person you have ever met who was trapped in this particular way. Because Adaze's story is not unusual. It is, in many ways, the most common story in the world. Adaze is 34 years old. She is intelligent. She is kind. She is perceptive in the way that people who have had to be very careful about the world around them tend to be perceptive. She can read a room in seconds, anticipate conflict before it arrives, make other people comfortable at the expense of her own. She grew up in a house where the emotional temperature was always uncertain, where love was conditional and inconsistent, where being small was safer than being visible, where wanting too much, hoping too openly, dreaming too loudly, was an invitation to disappointment at best and something worse at worst. So she learned. Children always learn. They are extraordinary adapters. She learned to make herself small, to dim the light of her own wanting, to be the one who managed, who handled, who kept things together so that things did not fall apart. And she became very good at all of this. Alarmingly good. So good that by the time she was an adult, she had no idea she was doing any of it. It was not a strategy anymore. It was a self. It was who Adaze was. She moved through her 20s in a haze of almost the relationship she wanted. She chose men who needed her competence, but were afraid of her depth, and she tolerated the distance because closeness had always felt dangerous. Almost the career she dreamed of. She had started 3 different ventures that each collapsed at the moment of real commitment, right when success became possible, because success would have made her visible in a way she had spent her whole life avoiding. Almost the health she wanted. She would spend a month treating her body with genuine care, and then something would shift. Something would tighten inside her, and the old patterns would return like water finding its level. She told herself a story about all of this. She had a very sophisticated, very convincing story. The timing was never right. The right opportunities had not arrived yet. The right people had not shown up. Things would change when the circumstances changed. She was not the kind of person who gave up. She was the kind of person who was waiting for the right moment. And this story was not entirely dishonest. There were grains of truth inside it. But it was not the whole truth, and the part it left out was the most important part. By the time Adaze was 34, she had been waiting for the right moment for 11 years. And the right moment kept refusing to arrive. And in the absence of the life she was waiting to begin, she had built a very comfortable life that looked, from the outside, like a full one. She had friends. She had routines. She had a job that used perhaps 30% of what she was actually capable of, which meant she never had to risk the 60% that was still tender and unproven and terrifying. She had what the writer Elizabeth Gilbert once called a half-life, not dead, not fully alive, just present, showing up, getting through. And here is what I want you to understand about Adaze. She was not living the wrong life because she was lazy. She was not in this position because she lacked intelligence or talent or worth. She was living a half-life, because every time she got close to a full one, her identity stepped in and redirected her back to safety. Because her identity, shaped by every experience, that had taught her that wanting was dangerous, that visibility invited harm. That success was something that happened to other people, was doing exactly what an identity does. It was keeping her consistent with itself. It was keeping her the girl who makes herself small, even though that girl was 34 years old and living in a body and a life that desperately, exhaustedly needed her to stop. The breaking point for Adaze came in an unexpected way. It did not come from a crisis, though those would come later. It came from an ordinary evening, when she was watching a video someone had shared about a woman who had built something extraordinary from nothing, and something inside Adaze shifted from the familiar low-grade envy she usually felt toward others, success, into something sharper, something that felt, when she finally allowed herself to name it, like grief. She was grieving the life she had not yet lived, grieving the dreams she had quietly, politely, very responsibly abandoned in order to remain safe, grieving the version of herself that had once believed things were possible, before life had taught her to be more careful with her hoping. And grief, as any honest person will tell you, is not a comfortable guest. Grief demands to be acknowledged. It does not do well when you try to manage it, or productively redirect it, or explain it away. It simply sits, heavy and insistent, until you agree to actually feel it. Adaze felt it, for the first time in a very long time. She sat with the full weight of the gap between the life she was living and the life she felt she was meant for. And something interesting happened in that sitting. The grief began to clarify into something less helpless, into something that felt, tentatively, almost like resolve. She had a friend named Chamaka, who had grown up in a similar household, but had somehow constructed a completely different identity from the same raw material. And one evening they were sitting together, and Chiamaka said something that Adaze had never heard articulated before. She said, "I realized that I was the author of the story I was living in, and I was writing the same story on repeat, because the ending was the only ending I knew how to write. And the only way to write a new ending was to become a different kind of writer." Adaze laughed when she heard this. She actually laughed, because it sounded like something you put on a motivational poster, not something that was meant to be taken seriously. But later that night, alone in the particular silence of 2 in the morning, she turned those words over and over in her mind, and slowly, with the kind of painful slowness of something finally becoming visible, that had been hiding in plain sight, she began to understand what they meant. She was not waiting for the right moment. She was waiting for someone to give her permission to become someone new. But there was no one who could give her that permission except herself. And the reason she had not given it to herself yet was because changing who she was meant letting go of everything she had built her survival on. It meant admitting that the small, careful, make yourself invisible version of Adaze, the one who had kept her safe through a very unsafe childhood, was not the version of her that was going to take her to the life she actually wanted. It meant saying goodbye, and Adaze had never been very good at goodbyes, but she was about to learn. The first thing she did was write a letter, not to anyone else, to the version of herself she was preparing to leave. She sat in her kitchen at midnight with a cup of tea that went cold before she finished, and she wrote to the girl who had made herself small. She wrote about all the ways that smallness had been necessary and intelligent, all the ways it had protected her. She wrote with genuine tenderness, because she understood now fully, in a way she had never allowed herself to understand before, that the small version of herself had not been a failure. She had been a survivor, and survivors deserve to be honored before they are released. When she was done writing, she held the letter for a long time, and then, very quietly, she folded it and put it away. And she said, not out loud, but in the place inside herself, where the most important decisions are made, thank you. And now it is time to go somewhere you cannot follow. That night, Adaze made no grand commitments. She changed nothing visibly. She simply decided, for the first time in her life, to stop waiting for permission from the universe to be more than she had allowed herself to be. And that decision, invisible to everyone around her, was the beginning of everything. Here is something I want you to understand about limiting beliefs, because this is where the conversation gets personal. A limiting belief is not a thought. It is not the thing you think on a Tuesday afternoon. A limiting belief is a conviction that has become so deeply embedded in your self-concept that it no longer presents itself as a belief at all. It presents itself as reality. It presents itself as just the way things are. As truth with a capital T that is not up for discussion, not available for questioning, simply and utterly the terrain of the world as it is. This is what makes limiting beliefs so difficult to identify and even more difficult to dismantle. They are invisible precisely because they are inside the lens you are using to see. You cannot easily examine the spectacles you are wearing if you are using them to look at everything else. The most common limiting beliefs cluster around a few central themes: worth, capability, belonging, safety, and they were formed, almost always, at a time in life when you did not have the cognitive tools to question them. They were formed in childhood, in adolescence, in the aftermath of significant losses or failures, in environments where certain ideas about you and the world were modeled so consistently and so powerfully that they became not beliefs but facts. I am not enough. Some version of this lives in the psychology of almost every human being on Earth. The specific content varies. Not smart enough, not attractive enough, not disciplined enough, not talented enough, not worthy of the kind of love I actually want, not deserving of the success I actually want. The words are different. The fundamental wound is the same, and it is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not stand up in your mind and wave a flag that says, "Here I am, here," is the thought that is limiting your entire life. Instead, it whispers. It murmurs in the background of every decision. It shows up as the reluctance to try, as the need to stay small so as not to be exposed, as the compulsive underestimation of your own abilities, as the strange relief that sometimes arrives alongside failure. Because at least now the suspicion that you were never quite enough has been confirmed, and you do not have to hold the tension of uncertainty anymore. Other limiting beliefs operate more specifically. People carry beliefs about money that are rooted in what they absorbed about money in childhood, that it is scarce, that it is dangerous, that people who have it are somehow morally compromised, that wanting it is greedy, that it comes with strings attached, that it never really lasts. They carry beliefs about relationships that reflect their earliest experience of intimacy, that love requires suffering, that closeness leads to abandonment, that people always eventually leave or disappoint, that vulnerability is a liability. They carry beliefs about their own capabilities that were installed by a single teacher, a single humiliation, a single experience of public failure that they have been organizing their choices around ever since. And here is the mechanism by which these beliefs maintain their power. They are self-confirming. Because you believe a thing, you behave in a way that makes the thing come true, and then the result confirms the belief, and the cycle deepens. The person who believes they are bad with money makes financial decisions that result in financial chaos, which confirms that they are bad with money. The person who believes they are not capable of being loved acts in ways in relationships that push people away, which confirms that they are not capable of being loved. The person who believes they cannot succeed sabotages themselves at the moment of potential success, which confirms that they cannot succeed. The evidence for the belief is generated by the belief. It is a closed loop, and from inside the loop, it is nearly impossible to see the loop for what it is. Because everything you experience seems to be simply confirming what you already know to be true. The first act of dismantling a limiting belief is not replacing it with a positive affirmation. This is a well-intentioned but largely ineffective approach that misunderstands the nature of belief. You cannot simply paste a new thought over an old conviction and expect the conviction to disappear. The brain does not work that way. The first act is something quieter and more demanding. It is the act of recognition, of naming the belief as a belief, of pulling it out of the category of fact and placing it into the category of story, not dismissing it, not attacking it, not hating yourself for having it, but looking at it clearly and saying, "This is a story I have been telling. This is a conclusion I drew from a particular set of experiences, at a particular time, with a particular set of tools. And while that story may have served a purpose then, I am under no obligation to keep living by it now." This act of recognition, truly seeing the belief as a belief rather than a fact, creates a small but critical space between you and it. And in that space, for the first time, you have a choice. Not to simply abandon the belief. You cannot abandon something that is woven into your nervous system with that level of depth by a simple act of will, but to begin questioning it, to begin looking for evidence that contradicts it, to begin deliberately and patiently building the case for a different story. This requires a kind of honest, courageous self-examination that most people spend enormous amounts of energy avoiding. It requires you to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, the period between releasing an old belief and fully inhabiting a new one, when neither story feels completely real, when you are in the in-between space that feels very much like being lost. But that space, that uncomfortable, unmoored, uncertain space, is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is the threshold. It is the narrow doorway between the life you have been living and the life you are choosing to step into. And there is another quality the work of dismantling limiting beliefs demands, and it is one that is frequently underestimated: compassion, not the soft, avoidant kind that excuses you from doing hard things, but the honest, clear-eyed kind that recognizes that you formed these beliefs under conditions that made sense of them. That the child who learned they were not enough was responding to real experiences of being made to feel that way. That the adolescent who concluded the world was not safe was drawing a reasonable inference from evidence that felt overwhelming at the time. The belief was not irrational in its origin. It was a reasonable conclusion from an unreasonable set of circumstances. What is unreasonable is continuing to let that conclusion made by a child, from inside the limited perspective a child has, govern the decisions of the adult you have become. You are not that child anymore. You have more resources now, more capacity, more perspective, more of yourself available to yourself, and you are under no obligation to keep serving sentences handed down by a judge who no longer exists. In a courtroom that closed decades ago, now let us talk about habits. Not because habits are separate from identity. They are not, but because understanding the relationship between habits and identity is perhaps the most practically important insight you can carry out of this entire conversation. Because habits are not just things you do. They are things you do, and in the doing, they continuously whisper to your nervous system. This is who you are. This is the kind of person you are. This is what people like you do. Every time you scroll for an hour, instead of working on the thing that matters, you are sending a message to your identity. I am someone who avoids difficult things. Every time you say yes to something you wanted to say no to, you are sending a message. I am someone who does not trust their own boundaries. Every time you reach for the distraction, instead of sitting with the discomfort, you are sending a message. I am someone who cannot tolerate the feeling of being challenged. These messages accumulate. They do not disappear once sent. They layer on top of each other like geological strata, building a dense, solid, weighty sense of who you are. And because the brain is always seeking consistency, always trying to make behavior match, the identity match behavior, the weight of these accumulated messages becomes the gravitational pull that keeps pulling you back to the behaviors that generated them in the first place. This is why changing your habits is not primarily a behavioral project. It is an identity project. The behavioral science researcher James Clear articulates this with elegant precision. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. The goal is not to run a marathon. The goal is to become a runner. The goal is not to write a book. The goal is to become a writer. The goal is not to meditate every day. The goal is to become the kind of person who turns inward and cultivates stillness. The behavior follows the identity, the sustainable behavior, the behavior that does not require constant willpower to maintain. The behavior that eventually becomes simply what you do follows from a fundamental shift in who you believe yourself to be. This means that the most powerful habit change does not start with asking, "What do I need to do differently?" It starts with asking, "Who do I need to become? What kind of person does the life I want require me to be?" And then, what are the smallest possible actions I can take right now, today, that a person like that would take? Because here is the thing about identity change. It does not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happens in the accumulation of small choices made consistently over time, each one casting a vote for a different story about who you are. Identity is not built in the climactic moments. It is built in the quiet ones. In the Tuesday mornings when no one is watching. In the moments of choice when the old pattern is available and easy and familiar. And you choose differently anyway. The habits that reinforce your current identity are not random. They are exquisitely organized around maintaining your existing self-concept, and identifying them requires a particular kind of honest attention, not the attention that looks for bad habits in the obvious sense, the substances, the screens, the obvious time wasters, but the attention that looks for the habits of thought, the habitual emotional responses, the ingrained relational patterns, The recurring stories that show up in every area of your life, wearing slightly different clothes. The habit of catastrophizing, of scanning for what might go wrong, of allowing the worst case scenario to be more vivid than any other possibility. This is a habit that reinforces an identity that sees the world as fundamentally threatening and the self as fundamentally vulnerable. The habit of chronic self-deprecation, of minimizing your accomplishments before anyone else can, of getting there first with the criticism, so it does not sting as much when it comes from outside. This is a habit that reinforces an identity that believes it is safer to be small than to be seen. The habit of business, of filling every moment with tasks and obligations and the productive appearance of forward motion, while never sitting still long enough to ask whether the motion is toward the right destination. This is a habit that reinforces an identity that is more comfortable doing than being. These habits are not character flaws. They are survival strategies that have outlived their usefulness, and recognizing them as such, not with shame, but with the kind of compassionate clarity that asks, why did this once make sense, and why does it no longer serve me, is the beginning of real change. Replacing them requires something specific. It requires replacement, not just removal. Because if you simply try to stop a habit without replacing it with something else, you are left with a gap. And the brain, that tireless pattern seeker, will fill the gap with something, usually with the old habit. The key is to ask, what does this habit provide me? What need is it meeting, even imperfectly, even at a cost? And then, what else could meet that need, in a way that aligns with who I am becoming, rather than who I have been? The habit of numbing meets a need for relief from tension, for permission to relax, for a lowering of the guard that feels necessary after a long day of being on. What else meets those needs? What might a person who has a healthy relationship with their own nervous system do instead? The habit of overworking meets a need for control, for the feeling that if you are doing enough, you are safe enough. What else meets that need? How does a person who trusts themselves, who knows they are enough even when they rest, navigate the impulse to do more? There is a practice that the most effective identity-based habit changes use, and it is deceptively simple. They ask themselves, at the moment of choice, what would the person I am becoming do here? Not what should I do? Not what is the right answer? But what does the future version of me, the one I am working toward, do in this moment? And then they do that thing. Not because it feels natural yet, it usually does not at first, but because every time they do it, they are laying a brick in the architecture of the new self. They are giving their nervous system a new piece of evidence. They are voting, once more, for a different story, and the votes accumulate, and the story changes, and one day, not dramatically, not in a single recognizable moment, but gradually and then all at once, the new behavior is simply what they do. The new response is simply who they are. And looking back, they can see the arc of 1,000 small choices, each barely visible on its own, that added up to the extraordinary thing of becoming someone new. Let us now talk about something that is perhaps the least celebrated and most essential dimension of real personal growth. Let us talk about the period that comes after you decide to change, but before you have become the new thing. The period that lives between the end of one chapter and the beginning of the next. The disorienting, uncomfortable, necessary passage through the unknown. Let us talk about the reality of reinvention. Because here is what the stories of transformation almost never show you. They show you the beginning, the moment of decision, the flash of clarity, the brave and cinematic commitment to change. And then they show you the end, the arrival, the transformation complete, the better life in full bloom. What they leave out is the middle, the long, unglamorous, profoundly uncomfortable middle, the weeks and months when you are no longer who you were, but not yet who you are becoming, when the old habits are still more familiar than the new ones, when the old thinking still shows up first, when the new identity feels like a costume you are wearing rather than a skin you inhabit, when you wonder whether you are making the whole thing up, whether the transformation is real, whether you were fooling yourself about your capacity for change. This middle period is where most people turn back, not because they are weak, because they are human, because the discomfort of the in-between is genuinely painful, because the brain keeps presenting the old world as safer, more reliable, more real than the new one that has not yet fully materialized, because the people around them are still relating to the old version of them, and the dissonance between who they are trying to become and how they are being seen is exhausting. Because the results of the new choices have not yet had time to compound into evidence. Because they are living on faith rather than proof, and faith, when you are deep in the uncomfortable middle, is a very thin and wavering thing. The psychologist William Bridges, who spent decades studying the psychology of transitions, made a distinction that I find extraordinarily useful. He distinguished between change and transition. Change, he said, is situational. It is the external event. The new job, the new relationship, the new city, the new commitment. Transition is psychological. It is the internal process of reorienting and redefining yourself in response to the change. And the most important part of the transition is not the new beginning. It is what he called the neutral zone, the in-between space where the old is gone and the new has not yet arrived. And he argued that most people flee the neutral zone as quickly as possible, leaping toward any new structure or certainty they can find, because the neutral zone is fundamentally uncomfortable. It is an encounter with emptiness, with unknowing, with the self stripped of its familiar markers. But here is what the neutral zone actually is. It is the fertile ground. It is the space where the old identity loosens its grip, just enough for something new to take root. It is the creative chaos before the new form emerges. And if you can learn to stay in it, not to flee it, not to numb it, not to prematurely foreclose it, by retreating to the familiar, extraordinary things become possible. This requires a particular set of capacities that are themselves a form of growth. The capacity to tolerate uncertainty, to be comfortable with not knowing, to resist the urge to have everything figured out, and instead trust the process of becoming. The capacity for self-compassion, not the soft, excuse-making kind that lets you off the hook for real growth, but the clear-eyed, steady kind that says, "This is hard, and I am doing it anyway," and being hard does not mean it is going wrong. The capacity for patience, the understanding that transformation has its own timeline, that you cannot rush the ripening, that the pressure to be already arrived is one of the most reliable ways to abandon the journey before it is complete. These capacities are not natural to most people. They must be developed, and the only way to develop them is to practice them in the very situations where they are most difficult to access. You become tolerant of uncertainty by staying in uncertainty rather than running from it. You develop self-compassion by extending it to yourself in the moments when every instinct is screaming criticism. You build patience by choosing to trust the process on the days when nothing seems to be moving. There is something important that happens in the neutral zone, something that tends to go unnoticed because you are so focused on the discomfort of what is not yet there. In the absence of the old identity's constant direction, your actual values become clearer. The things you genuinely care about, stripped of the performance and the protection and the habit of being who you have always been, begin to surface with a kind of raw clarity they rarely had before. This is the gift of the in-between. It is the time when, if you are paying attention, you learn who you actually are underneath, who you have been required to be. And something else is required, something that is easy to skip in the enthusiasm of the new beginning, but becomes essential in the long middle: community. Not the kind of community that validates you unconditionally, that tells you you are doing great, no matter what, that mistakes comfort for care, but the kind of community that sees who you are becoming and holds that vision for you on the days when you cannot hold it for yourself. The kind of people who have been through their own versions of this passage and can say, with genuine authority, I know this place, I know how it feels, and I also know what is on the other side of it. Growth is not a solo sport, not the deep kind. And part of reinvention is being willing to reach toward the people who can help you cross the threshold, who can model what the other side looks like, who can remind you when your identity is shrinking that you made a commitment to expand. Your environment matters more than most people realize. You will become, over time, a reflection of the conversations you have most often, the ideas you are most surrounded by, the standards that the people closest to you hold for themselves and for you. Choosing your environment with the same intentionality you bring to choosing your habits is not elitism. It is wisdom. Now I want to talk about something that might seem paradoxical, given everything we have been discussing. I want to talk about who you are building toward, because one of the most powerful tools available to any person who is serious about personal transformation is the practice of deliberately designing the identity they are growing into. Not the fantasy, not the highlight reel of the ideal life, but the actual, grounded, specific, values-based vision of the person you intend to become. Psychologists call this the possible self, the representation you hold of who you could be in the future, both who you are hoping to become and who you fear becoming. And research consistently shows that people who hold a clear, vivid, emotionally resonant image of their possible selves are significantly more successful at sustained behavior change than those who focus primarily on changing behaviors in the absence of an identity vision. Because the vision provides direction, it provides a North Star for the thousands of small decisions that otherwise get made by default, by habit, by whoever happens to be exerting the most pressure in the moment. So how do you build this vision? It begins not with achievement, but with character. Not with what you want to have or do or accomplish, but with who you want to be. What qualities do you want to define you? What values do you want to organize your life around? What kind of person? In terms of how you show up in the world, in how you treat others, in how you respond to difficulty, in how you engage with your own life. What kind of person do you want, looking back from the end of a long life, to have been? These are not small questions. They are the foundational ones, and they are questions that most people never fully, honestly answer. They are replaced, in the business and noise of daily life, with smaller questions. What should I eat for lunch? How do I manage this meeting? How do I get through this week? The urgent perpetually displaces the essential, and the result is a life built by default, rather than by design. Intentional identity design begins with clarity about your core values, not the values you think you should have. Not the ones that sound impressive in a conversation, but the ones that, when violated, cause you the deepest discomfort. The ones that, when honored, produce the deepest sense of aliveness. The ones that represent the truest expression of who you actually are underneath the layers of adaptation. Finding these requires a specific kind of introspection that most of us have never been systematically invited to do. It requires asking, when have I felt most like myself? What was I doing? What was I honoring? What values were present in those moments that are frequently absent in the ordinary rhythm of my days? Personal standards are the practical expression of the identity you are building. A personal standard is not a rule imposed from outside. It is a commitment that flows from your values, from your vision of who you are becoming, from your deepest understanding of what you are here to do and be. And personal standards are extraordinarily powerful because they remove the daily need for decision. When you have a standard around how you treat your body, you do not have to decide every morning whether today is a day you take care of yourself. The decision is already made. When you have a standard around how you spend your time, around the quality of presence you bring to your work and your relationships, around how you respond when things go wrong, these standards become the architecture of the self you are constructing, day by deliberate day. The future self you are building is not a fixed destination. It is a direction. And every time you make a choice that aligns with the values and standards of that direction, you are not just moving toward it. You are, in a very real sense, already being it. The future self is not something you arrive at eventually. It is something you begin inhabiting now, in the choices you make today, with the awareness that who you are is, at every moment, being created by who you choose to be in this moment. There is a practice I want to offer you. Once you have a clear sense of the person you are becoming, their values, their standards, the quality of presence they bring to their life, begin to ask, before significant decisions, what would that person do? Not as a performance, not as a way of pretending to be someone you are not yet, but as a compass, as an orientation device that keeps you pointed toward the person you have committed to becoming, even when the old identity is pulling you in a different direction. And here is the important thing about this practice. Do not wait until you feel like that person before you start acting like them. Feelings follow behavior, not the other way around. You do not become a courageous person by waiting until you feel brave. You become a courageous person by doing the brave thing while you are still afraid. You do not become a disciplined person by waiting until you feel motivated. You become a disciplined person by acting with discipline on the days when you feel nothing like it. The feeling catches up. The identity solidifies around the repeated behavior. But the behavior must come first. Let us now talk about the one thing that separates the people who genuinely transform from the people who talk about it. And you already know, somewhere in your bones, what this thing is. You have heard it before. You have probably rolled your eyes at it before, because it sounds so simple and so obvious that it seems almost insulting. But the fact that you have heard it, and perhaps rolled your eyes at it, and still find yourself here, still finding that the transformation has not yet arrived in the way you want it to, suggests that knowing it and living it are still separated by a gap that deserves closer examination. The thing is consistency, not intensity, not the dramatic burst, not the grand gesture or the extreme measure or the life-overhauling commitment made in a single fired-up moment. Consistency, the quiet, unsexy, profoundly powerful practice of showing up, again and again and again, for the things that matter, even when you do not feel like it, even when the feeling of inspiration has long since left the building, even when nothing seems to be working yet, even when every cell in your body is singing the familiar siren song of the old identity, trying to pull you back to who you used to be. Here is why consistency is so transformative at the level of identity. Every single time you do the thing your old identity would not do, you are creating a fracture in the old story. A small one, barely visible, but real, and every time you do it again, the fracture deepens slightly, and again, slightly deeper, and over hundreds of repetitions, over months of small, consistent choices, the fracture runs so deep through the old story that it can no longer bear the weight of your life. The old identity begins to crumble, not dramatically, not all at once, but inevitably, in the way that all things that are no longer structurally sound eventually do. And in the space left by the crumbling of the old, something new is being built. Not in grand sweeping construction, but brick by quiet brick. Each morning you wake up and do what the person you are becoming would do. You lay a brick. Each interaction, where you show up with the values of the new identity rather than the habits of the old one, you lay a brick. Each moment of choosing growth over comfort, honesty over performance, courage over familiarity, you lay a brick. And the structure that accumulates from all these quietly laid bricks is over time, undeniable. It is you, not the old you, not the aspirational fantasy of a perfect future you, but the genuine, lived, hard-won, real you that existed underneath everything you thought you were. The neuroscience supports this completely. Every time you choose a new behavior, the neural pathway associated with that behavior is activated and slightly strengthened. Every time you resist the old behavior, the neural pathway associated with it is slightly weakened. Neurons that fire together wire together, and neurons that no longer fire together gradually lose their connection. This is the physical substrate of identity change. Repeated choices create new patterns in the brain. Repeated patterns become automatic responses. Automatic responses become, over time, the default, the thing you do without thinking, the new habit, the new self. Here is what this means practically. You do not need a perfect plan. You do not need perfect conditions. You do not need to have completely resolved every fear, dissolved every limiting belief, identified every resistance before you begin. You need only begin, imperfectly, incompletely, with all your doubt and uncertainty and residual old identity thinking still present, because the doing is not in service of the feeling ready. The doing creates the feeling of being ready. The action precedes the confidence. The movement precedes the certainty. And the consistency of showing up, day after day, in the direction of who you are becoming, is itself the most powerful signal you can send to the part of you that still does not believe transformation is possible. But here is the part about consistency that is most frequently misunderstood, and that misunderstanding causes more abandoned transformations than perhaps anything else. Consistency does not mean perfection. Consistency does not mean an unbroken record of right choices. Consistency means returning, It means that when you fall back, and you will fall back, everyone does, the fall back is not the failure. You return. You get back on the path. Not after waiting until Monday, or until the new month, or until the shame has fully metabolized, but as soon as possible, as simply as possible, without the elaborate ritual of self-punishment that so many people mistake for accountability, but is actually just an extended wave of staying in the old identity. Real accountability looks like this. I made a choice that was not aligned with who I am becoming. I see it clearly. I understand, if I can, what drove it, and I return to my direction, not with drama, not with lengthy self-criticism, not with a vow that it will never happen again, because such vows are made by the ego rather than the self and are worth very little. Just I return, quietly, today, with the same commitment I had before the stumble. This is what the people who genuinely change are doing, behind all the success stories and the transformation narratives. They are returning, continuously. They are not superhuman. They are not operating from a different grade of willpower. They have simply internalized the understanding that returning is not failure's opposite. Returning is the journey. The commitment is not the commitment to never fall. It is the commitment to always return. And there is no more powerful identity statement you can make than to return, again and again, to the direction of who you are choosing to become. There is another dimension to consistency that is easy to overlook. It compounds, not in a linear way, but exponentially. The first month of consistent new choices produces barely detectable results, and this is discouraging, and this is also completely predictable, and most people quit during this period. The second and third months produce slightly more visible results, and some people stay for this. But the fourth and fifth and sixth months and beyond, into the territory of a year, 2 years, of sustained consistent direction, this is where the compounding becomes undeniable, where the accumulation of all those small bricks reveals itself as an edifice, where the person you have been quietly becoming is suddenly, unmistakably, evidently present in your life. Not just in how you feel inside, but in the tangible reality of what your days look like, who you are surrounded by, what opportunities are finding you, what kind of person the world is encountering when it encounters you. The compound effect of consistent identity, aligned action, is one of the most extraordinary forces available to a human being. And it is available to every human being, regardless of where they are starting from, regardless of what their history contains, regardless of how many times they have tried before. It requires only one thing: the willingness to return. I want to tell you about someone I will call Marcus. And Marcus is the kind of man who used to believe that who he was fixed. Not explicitly. He never would have said it out loud that way. But the belief was there, running quietly underneath everything, the way a current runs beneath still water. The belief that by the time you reach a certain age, by the time certain experiences have accumulated, by the time the world has shaped and reshaped you enough times, there is only so much you can do. You manage, you cope, you make the best of what you have been given, but you do not fundamentally change, because the person you are is, in the end, the person you are. Marcus was 41 years old, and he was, by most external measures, doing fine. A comfortable job in logistics management, a small house he had been meaning to renovate for 6 years, a relationship that had quietly gone cold over a period he could not quite pinpoint, not a dramatic cooling, but the slow, barely perceptible chill of two people who had stopped choosing each other and were now simply cohabiting with their routines. 2 children he loved with a force that sometimes surprised him, and whom he was aware he was not quite fully present for in the ways that mattered most, because being fully present required a quality of aliveness that he had not felt in a very long time. He was tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind of tired that comes from living at less than what you are. The change, if you can call it that. Because it did not feel like a change at the time, it felt like a moment of absolute unbearable clarity happened on a Tuesday. Not a remarkable Tuesday, not a Tuesday with a dramatic inciting event, just an ordinary Tuesday. When Marcus was sitting in his car in the parking lot of the office, after a meeting in which he had listened to himself give the same presentation he had given, with minor variations, for the past 7 years, and he had watched himself do it with the polished ease of someone who had done a thing so many times that they no longer needed to be present for it. And in the parking lot, with the engine running and the radio playing something he was not listening to, he asked himself a question he had never allowed himself to ask before. Is this it? Not as a complaint, not as self-pity, but as a genuine, terrifying, honest inquiry. Is this genuinely what the rest of his life was going to look like? This particular shade of fine? And if the answer was yes, and in that moment, with the cold, clear sight of someone who is finally choosing not to look away, he understood that if he did not change something, the answer was yes, then what was he willing to do about it? What followed was not dramatic. He began a conversation with himself that had never really happened before. He began, for the first time in a long time, to actually look at who he had become, not with hatred, but with something approaching honest curiosity. He looked at the story he was living in, the story of the man who was responsible, who did not make waves, who provided stability, but had forgotten somewhere along the way that stability, without aliveness, is just stagnation. He looked at the habits that reinforced this story, the way he defaulted to agreement, rather than expressing what he actually thought. The way he spent his evenings in a low, grade-numbed state because full presence felt like too much effort. The way he had slowly, almost imperceptibly, stopped having aspirations. And then he did something that his old identity would have immediately talked him out of doing. He told someone about it. He told his wife Nadia, who had been waiting for exactly this conversation for years without ever quite knowing that was what she was waiting for. And the conversation was terrible and necessary and honest in a way that nothing between them had been for a very long time. And then the brick-laying began. Small daily, quiet choices. He started getting up an hour earlier, not to maximize productivity, but to spend time with himself before the day's demands arrived. He enrolled in a design course that had nothing to do with logistics, nothing to do with practicality or financial sense, everything to do with the part of him that had been quietly atrophying for 15 years. He started having actual conversations with his children rather than simply supervising their presence. He started bringing real opinions to meetings rather than smooth consensus. And with Nadia, slowly, imperfectly, with many reversions and restarts, he began showing up as someone who was actually there. None of this was easy. There were days when the old Marcus was so much louder in his head than the new one that he could barely hear himself think. There were weeks when nothing seemed to be working, when the new choices felt artificial and not quite him. When he wondered whether any of this was real, or whether he was simply performing a transformation, he was not actually capable of, but he laid the bricks. He kept laying them. His daughter said something to him one evening that told him more about how much had changed than any measure he might have applied himself. She said, "Dad, you seem happier," not in a way that seemed like she was reporting something surprising, but in a way that suggested she was now simply noticing what had become, gradually, the new normal. Marcus had not become a different person. He had, with tremendous effort and a great deal of discomfort, and many stumbles and restarts, become more fully himself. He had shed the identity that had accumulated not from choice, but from default. And underneath all of that accumulated smallness. The person he actually was had been there the whole time, waiting with extraordinary patience to be invited back. I want to speak now, as we near the end of this journey we have been on together, about something that I think matters more than anything else we have discussed. I want to speak about the moment, the threshold, the place where every person who is serious about transformation eventually arrives. There comes a moment, and you may already know this moment. You may be standing in it right now, when you have to make a choice that is not really about a job, or a relationship, or a habit, or a goal. It is a choice about loyalty, and it is the most important choice you will ever make. The choice is this: will you remain loyal to the person you have always been? Or will you become loyal to the person you are capable of becoming? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a real one, and it is more difficult than it sounds, because loyalty to the old self is not always born of love for who you have been. Sometimes it is born of fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of failure, the fear of discovering that you changed everything and it still was not enough, the fear of becoming someone your past cannot follow, the fear that the people who have loved the old version of you will not recognize or love the new one. These fears are real. They deserve to be taken seriously, but they must not be mistaken for wisdom. Loyalty to the person you have always been, when that person is no longer serving your growth, is not fidelity. It is imprisonment. It is choosing the familiar cage over the unfamiliar sky. And while the cage may feel safe, while you may have learned every corner of it and decorated it so it feels like home, it is still a cage. And you were not made for cages. Growth is not about hating your past. This is something I want to be very clear about, because the culture of self-improvement often makes this mistake. It presents transformation as a rejection of who you were, as if the old self was simply wrong, simply a problem to be solved, simply a failure to be ashamed of. This is not only inaccurate, it is counterproductive. The old identity, the limited one, the small one, the one that is ready to be released, did not appear in your life as a mistake. It appeared as an adaptation, as an intelligent, creative response to the circumstances and experiences you were navigating at the time it was formed. The child who learned to make themselves invisible was being smart. The adolescent who learned to perform confidence, they did not feel was coping with something real. The young adult who swallowed their dreams and chose security was protecting something tender and irreplaceable. The old identity deserves not contempt but gratitude. It got you here. It carried you through things that needed carrying. It was the best version of you that was available at the time with the resources you had. And now you have more resources, more understanding, more capacity, more of yourself available to yourself. And so you are being asked to build a new version. Not because the old one failed, but because you succeeded in growing beyond it. This is the heart of it. This is the truth that holds everything together. Transformation is not the elimination of the old self. It is the evolution of it. It is saying to every version of yourself that came before, I see you. I understand what you were doing. I am grateful you kept me alive. I am grateful you kept me moving. I am grateful you brought me this far. And now I am going somewhere you were not built for. And so I have to go forward without you, because every new chapter of life requires the death of an old identity. Every version of you that you are about to become requires that a previous version of you be released. And this is not a loss. It is the most profound kind of growth. It is the proof that you are alive in the fullest sense, not merely breathing, not merely persisting, but actually deliberately, courageously evolving. The threshold is there. It has always been there. It is right here, right now, in this moment. And on the other side of it is not a perfect life. On the other side of it is your life, the one that is fully yours, the one that fits who you actually are rather than who you were shaped to be, the one that is built, day by patient day, from the most honest and courageous choices you are capable of making. The old version of you carried you beautifully this far, and the next version of you is waiting. It is not waiting behind some future circumstance or perfect condition or lucky break. It is waiting in the choice you make right now, in the choice you make tomorrow, in the quiet, consistent, daily decision to become, and that, in the end, is all transformation ever is, a decision, made again and again, with love, with courage, with patience, and with the unshakable faith that who you are becoming is worth every difficult, beautiful, necessary step of the goodbye. There is also the question of what psychologists call possible selves, the collection of representations we carry of who we might become. Research by Hazel Marcus and Paula Nurius in the 1980s revealed something profound. People do not just have a single self concept. They carry a whole gallery of potential selves. The hoped-for self, the feared self, the expected self, the self they feel obligated to become, and the richness or poverty of this gallery significantly shapes the range of choices a person perceives as available to them. Someone with a thin gallery of possible selves, whose imagination of what they could be is narrow, constrained by the limits of what they have seen modeled around them, will consistently make choices that keep them inside that narrow range. Someone with a rich, vivid, emotionally resonant gallery of possible selves will perceive a wider landscape of options and will be more motivated to move toward the better ones. This is why representation matters so profoundly in human development. Not in the abstract political sense, though that matters too, but in the deeply personal psychological sense. When you see people who share your background, your starting point, your particular version of ordinariness, and you see those people doing extraordinary things, living in ways that once seemed impossible, your gallery of possible selves expands. The horizon of what you can imagine for yourself moves outward, and with it, the horizon of what you will attempt, risk, and commit to also moves. This means one of the most transformative things you can do, early in the process of becoming someone new, is to deliberately and consciously expand your gallery. To seek out stories of people who came from where you came from and arrived somewhere you want to go, not to worship them or to compare yourself to them in a way that generates shame, but to use their existence as evidence. Evidence that what you want is possible. Evidence that the possible self you are reaching toward is not a fantasy, but an available destination. The human brain responds to evidence. It is not primarily moved by abstract possibility, but by demonstrated reality. And when it sees demonstrated reality in the lives of people who started where you started, the landscape of what it believes you can become shifts. There is a concept in sociology called the looking glass self, first articulated by the sociologist Charles Cooley over a century ago. The idea is deceptively simple and enormously powerful. We develop our sense of self by imagining how we appear to other people, and then by imagining what those other people think of us based on how we appear, and then by internalizing those imagined evaluations as part of our identity. We are, in a very real sense, reflected selves. We see ourselves in the mirror of other people's perceptions, and over time, those reflected images become our self-image. The profound implication of this is that when you change, when you begin showing up differently, choosing differently, valuing different things, the reflections change. And the discomfort this creates is not just social, it is existential. Because the reflections have been part of how you have understood yourself. And when the mirror shows you something you do not recognize, even if what it shows is better, even if what it shows is truer, the disorientation can be profound. This is why so many people experience what I would call identity vertigo during genuine transformation, a dizzying sense of not quite knowing who they are, of feeling like an imposter in the new life they are building, of half expecting someone to expose them as a fraud. This is not a sign of inauthenticity. It is the predictable, normal, entirely manageable experience of being between selves, of having released one mirror and not yet found another that shows you who you are becoming with full clarity. And what most people do in this moment of vertigo is reach backward toward the familiar reflection, toward the old identity that at least has the virtue of being known. Understanding that the vertigo is temporary, that it is the expected experience of the in-between rather than evidence that you are going the wrong way, is what allows you to stay in the discomfort rather than retreat from it. The looking glass self also explains why your social environment is not incidental to your transformation, it is fundamental. The mirrors that surround you are shaping what you see when you look at yourself. Spend enough time surrounded by people who reflect back a limited, small, cautious version of you, and that version becomes harder and harder to escape. Surround yourself with people who reflect back a capable, growing, becoming version of you, and that version becomes easier and easier to inhabit. You are not, as the self-help mythology sometimes suggests, solely the architect of your own identity. You are the co-creator of it. And the people around you are your collaborators, whether you have chosen them consciously for that role or not. The daily practice of becoming is not glamorous. It does not look like the transformation sequences in films, where a few powerful scenes of determined effort are followed by a dramatic reveal of the fully arrived new self. It looks like waking up on a Wednesday morning when you did not sleep well and your old patterns are pulling at you from every direction and choosing, again, to be the person you are committed to being. It looks like having a conversation with someone who still sees the old you and choosing to represent the new you anyway. Even when every ingrained relational habit is trying to pull you back into the familiar dynamic, it looks like sitting with discomfort, instead of reaching for the anesthetic of whatever your particular flavor of numbing happens to be, and discovering, each time you do this, that you are slightly more capable of it than you were before. The daily practice of becoming is incremental in a way that can be maddening if you are expecting quick results. But it is also quietly cumulative in a way that surprises you if you stay with it long enough. There will come a day, and you cannot predict exactly when, because it is not a single day, but a gradual accumulation that tips over an imperceptible threshold when you look at how you are responding to the circumstances of your life, and you realize that you are no longer responding the way you used to. The old pattern did not arrive automatically. You considered it and chose something else. And the choosing was, in that moment, easier than it would have been 6 months ago. That ease, that small and undramatic ease, is evidence. It is proof. It is the new identity, not yet fully arrived but visibly en route, showing up in the only place that matters, in the actual texture of your actual life. There is something worth naming about the relationship between identity and courage, because the kind of courage that transformation requires is not the dramatic, battle-facing kind that makes for good stories. It is the much quieter, much more sustained, much less celebrated kind of courage that says, I will continue to choose, on a Tuesday afternoon, in a moment that no one will ever know about or applaud, to be the person I am, becoming rather than the person I used to be. This is the courage of integrity, of aligning your private choices with your stated values, your daily behavior with your deepest commitments. And it is, in its own quiet way, one of the most demanding and most noble things a human being can do. The most important things in life rarely announce themselves with fanfare. The moment when you genuinely shift from protecting the old self to building the new one does not usually feel dramatic. It feels quiet, ordinary, slightly anticlimactic, in the way that all genuinely important choices tend to feel in the actual moment of making them, before the distance of time allows you to see their magnitude. You will not always know, when you are in the middle of it, that you are in the middle of something significant. You will just know that you made a different choice today than you would have made a year ago, and that the choice felt, in a very quiet and unremarkable way, like the truth. Trust that. Trust the quiet choices. Trust the unremarkable days when nothing dramatically different happens and you simply, without drama, without an audience, without the feeling of transformation as a powerful wave washing over you, you simply show up as someone slightly more aligned with who you are meant to be than you were yesterday. These are the days that matter most, not the peak experiences, not the breakthrough moments, the Wednesdays, the ordinary mornings, the small decisions made in the privacy of your own character, witnessed by no one but yourself and accumulated into the person you are, slowly and certainly becoming.